On today's podcast, we dive deep into the Southeast Asian music market with industry veteran Andy Griffin. Andy shares his insights on the explosion of the Philippines music scene, post-COVID, the advantages and challenges of digital platforms, and why songs are getting shorter. We also explore the intricacies of breaking into the South Asian music market and the East Asian markets, from a cultural nuance to the power of local collaborations. Andy also reveals his top advice for artists aspiring to build longevity in their careers, balancing traditional promotional methods with today's technological advances. Plus, we discuss his personal journey from playing in bands to recording in exotic locations and the significant growth he's witnessed in the Southeast Asian music industry. You can't afford to miss it. Insiders, are you ready?
Welcome to MUBUTV's Music Business Insider Podcast, where our mission is to educate, empower, and engage artists and music business professionals who are dedicated to having a successful career in the new music industry. Here are your hosts, Ritch, Esra, and Eric Knight. Welcome back, Insiders, to another episode of the MUBUTV Music Business Insider Podcast, where our mission is to educate, empower, and engage your music career. On today's episode, we bring you a raw and revealing conversation with music industry veteran Andy Griffin. We dive deep into his experiences and insights on emerging markets, particularly in Southeast Asia, and the game-changing impact of digital platforms. Andy also shares his unique perspectives on how streaming services and social media have revolutionized music distribution, while also introducing new challenges for artists to stand out in an increasingly competitive landscape. We discuss the importance of balancing traditional and modern promotional strategies and why strong songwriting and an unwavering work ethic are crucial for success in today's music industry. From strategies for breaking into the lucrative South Asian markets to the impact of technological advancements on cross-border collaboration, Andy shares insider tips that are invaluable for aspiring artists and industry professionals alike. You don't want to miss it.
Welcome back, Insiders. Today's featured guest is music executive and artist manager Andy Griffin. This was a fantastic, insightful conversation, I think, and I think you're going to really enjoy it for many, many reasons. Number one, the region that Andy is in the world is Southeast Asia. That is a very, very important region, which we'll get into for multiple reasons. But the growth of that particular area of the world is very important for music. It's important for touring. It's important for bands, and it's an evolving market culturally and musically. The thing that I thought was so interesting about the point that he made was that in Thailand in particular, which is only one of the countries in Southeast Asia, that signings are often based on gut feel. You know, that analytics are increasingly used, but that this approach contrasted so much more with like the layered process in the UK and how he spoke about, you know, it's a different kind of criteria that's used. So that I thought was a very interesting point initially.
Yeah, and I also thought what he talked about the Thai music scene, about it being transformed from focusing on mainstream syrupy pop to including more underground electronica, post-punk, and even math rock, which is, you know, incredible to think that that region would be doing that, you know, with the reputation that it's had before with more popular music. And so I thought that was very interesting how all these regions of the world are starting to evolve. We talk about the African market a lot on the show and how that's starting to evolve, and there's offices that are showing up from all the majors and everything. So it's a really interesting time to see how everything is evolving.
Yeah, and to your point, Eric, what I find fascinating about that is that we've seen that in so many regions of the world where the interest in such a wider diversity of music has come from exposure. And, you know, to the point you made, I mean, Southeast Asia, which is a market that I'm very familiar with for the last 40 years, was very AC based.
Right.
Air Supply, Dionne Warwick, Celine Dion. I mean, those artists are all in like the AC kind of category. That's what that market always loved. Right. And like to your point, now you see it because people are exposed,
broadening and
much more broadening into a bigger area. One of the things that he said, which I thought was just fascinating, is that, you know, in terms of the cultural differences between regions, is the idea that often Thai artists, for example, he said, come from better off backgrounds, you know, socioeconomic, compared to European and American artists, which he felt may impact their drive and their work ethic. I thought that was I've never heard anyone talk about that, but I guess logically that makes sense. Where somebody comes
being
from,
more affluent.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Right.
Like sometimes, that's the cliche. Look, I've known
Right.
a lot of wealthy people who are very, very driven because they didn't come from wealth.
Right.
But when you come from that from the beginning,
does that affect the drive and the energy?
Yeah,
that you put
that
forth
was
into your
fascinating. I'd never heard anyone speak about that
Yeah.
in relation to artists and drive and building a career.
Yeah, I also thought when he talked about on the recorded side that the Thai industry has, the Thai industry development has mirrored the rise of indie labels alongside traditionally dominant major labels like, Grammys, which continues to, follow an in-house artist development model. So I just find it interesting how they're evolving from this, which I guess you can think about what you talked about earlier in your earlier point where Southeast Asia was more AC driven. That was the gatekeepers of that area at that time that I guess had a stranglehold. And now that these things are starting to opening up more, you're seeing, a lot of this evolution in the industry taking shape where people are going more on an indie route.
Yeah, and they're doing it because of technology, and the technology is there exposing them to the wider and more diverse elements of music that are available today.
And with that, insiders, sit back, relax, and enjoy our featured conversation with Andy Griffin.
Andy, welcome.
Hi guys. Thanks for having me on the podcast today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for doing this. This is a real pleasure to speak with you. We always like to begin these conversations with, did you always know that music was going to be your professional career path in life?
Right. Well, I started out like a lot of people in bands. So I think I was about 11 years old when my mum bought me my first snare drum, to the chagrin to the rest of my family. And then that kind of just led on to, being in bands and kind of led me down the recording path more than anything else. We had a little Tascam 4-track. And I realized probably around, 17, 18 that I didn't necessarily want to go down the route that all of my friends were going. So it was around that time where I actually thought, you know what, I want to be a sound engineer. I want to be a producer. So that was the beginning of my formal education. I went to music tech college up in Newcastle in the northeast of England. And that in turn led then to, I want to make a career out of this. And I actually started on the other side of the mixing desk, I guess. I was working in studios, and that in turn led to working at major labels around the mid-90s in London and so on and so forth. So it's probably around 11, 12 years old where I thought, this is what I want to do for a living. And, the whole kind of excitement and getting swept up in the live scene and working in studios and working with, people you'd seen on Top of the Pops, that kind of what really grabbed me initially.
Yeah, that's great. That was a very, very interesting time in the UK. That was kind of around that time when I began my own business with the Music Business Registry in the early 90s. But the UK was a very, very, very important market at that time and had a lot of things going on for it.
I mean, it was, quite vibrant. And obviously the period I'm talking about was like mid-80s when, I don't know if you remember the Brothers in Arms CD, the Dire Straits album, which kind of like really... Well, yeah, absolutely. So that announced the CD on the world, and kind of the labels were like, "Oh, okay, here's a great way of making a lot of money in a very quick way." So I was only around 13, 14 years old at that time. Another thing that really hit me though was the whole Live Aid, Band Aid thing, and Queen and David Bowie and those sort of live performances. They really, really grabbed me, and it was around that time when I actually started playing in school bands, which I'm sure you guys all did, and everybody probably listening to this podcast has done as well.
Andy, your career began in music in the UK. And in 2006, you ended up moving to Southeast Asia, specifically Bangkok, where you've been for the last 18 years. How has the music scene there evolved over the last decade?
Over the last decade, I mean, that's a great question, because when I first arrived there on the live side, it was really kind of focused around, your Celine Dion's and your Stings of this world. They really didn't have what you describe as a grassroots kind of scene. And one thing I've noticed, COVID notwithstanding, there's a lot more local venues, a lot more smaller venues. You've got guys who are really passionate about booking smaller artists, and the Thai scene particularly has grown and grown from what would be, sort of piano ballads and kind of quite syrupy pop music to a lot of underground electronica. There's also a lot of post-punk. It's very popular over there, and a lot of the math rock artists are also very popular. So the scene, particularly in Bangkok, is really vibrant now, which is great to see. Like any city, it has its own issues with noise abatement and venues being closed down and so on and so on. But the scene is healthy, and you find that a lot of people help out each other. So it's actually great to be a part of that. I'm obviously not Thai, but I like the fact that I can go to most venues in the city at any one time. And it's like, oh, hey, Andy, how you doing? Come and listen to this track. Or we want to talk to you about a release strategy. Or, I'm in this new band now. I was in another band. Come and see me play at Jam next week. So it's a really, really, it's like a microcosm of London, I guess. It's, I spent 11 years I moved over there, and it's over the last 10 years, it's definitely developed. On the recorded side, on the label side, again, it's developed from really, it was initially, there was one major label there called Grammy, which was more like it's in its 45th year, I think now, and it's more like a Motown model where they would bring the artists in, develop everything in-house. And so over the last 10 years, you've had really the advent of quite a lot of big indies, a number of which I've worked for. So you have Love Is and Loved Her and What the Duck, for example, are a great indie Thai pop label doing a lot of good work over there. And then of course you have the majors, which I've also worked for over the time. So Warner Music, for one, out there are really the market leader in terms of the DSPs and so on, and are leading the charge there, particularly on Thai pop. So it's a lot more healthy than it was when I arrived. My initial work over there actually was in artist management, but I was help managing a UK-based artist. So it was a good introduction to Asia, but I wasn't necessarily working within the Asian scene, if that makes sense.
It does. It's so interesting listening to you, Andy, because, you're speaking about some of the major differences musically. It was a very interesting point. As you were speaking, I was thinking, when I used to do A&R for Arista, one of the things that I do remember about the whole region was, number one, it didn't really have an infrastructure for the music industry. It was loaded with piracy in the 80s. Yeah. But more importantly, to your point, culturally, the whole sort of Southeast Asian market, and Asian market in particular, was very, very AC oriented. And that is only something that's changed recently. Air Supply, Christopher Cross, Sheena Easton, man. Barbra Streisand. I mean, these were the kinds of acts that did really, really well in that era. And it was just so interesting to hear you say the same thing about, Celine Dion and so forth. I want to ask you another question regarding your experiences there. What would you say are the key differences that you observed in the music business between the UK and the various Southeast Asian markets that you've worked in? Because you mentioned the independent labels, but you've also worked at majors as well. So can you talk about that?
For sure. I mean, the key thing is there are a lot more hands-on over there. I know obviously in this part of the world, actually in the UK right now, there's been a lot of changes over the last few years in terms of personnel and the way that labels are arranged. But particularly in Thailand, you won't find a label with huge marketing department or a huge promotions department. It tends to be a lot of people. It's a lot more hands-on. The artists that are signed are kind of more developed, not necessarily by an A&R department, but more so maybe by the MD. But certainly at some of the bigger independent labels I've worked at there, the scouting network and the signing is a lot more hands-on and a lot more kind of done in-house, as opposed to, say, in the UK, where it might have to go through several layers before an artist is signed or even looked at. They tend to go a lot more. They used to actually go a lot more with the gut feel, but obviously now you have analytics coming into play. So that, from a business point of view, they're still looking at the numbers, but you do find over there are still people running big to small independent rock labels who are basically signing artists on their gut feel, which is great to see. I mean, I'm of that school myself, you see. I'm of that era.
Yeah, a lot of our guests talk about that, where we ask them about the gut feel, and that seems to be still the operating way, which is great. How do you adapt your approach to music and artist management when you move to Southeast Asia, considering the different cultural and musical landscapes in 2006?
The key thing I've noticed working with artists over there, and I've said this to a lot of people, and obviously I'm British, so I was in bands back in the day, and, we used to kind of work in supermarkets to earn money so we could stack shelves, so we could, have rehearsal time, and we'd be, absolutely falling over ourselves to go into a studio. What I found particularly in Thailand is a lot of the artists come from quite different backgrounds where, say, they're probably a little bit better off than your average European or American artist. And so they don't really need to work quite as hard, if that makes sense, in terms of getting that time in the studio or that attention, or getting that maybe they can use an independent PR person or something like that. And the knock-on effect of that, I was looking at some notes before I spoke to you guys, and I always kind of want my artists to work harder than me. especially if you're managing a group of people. And let's not lie to ourselves. You're usually managing young people, right? And they're going to be creative. They're going to have lots of ideas outside of the music. And I really want them to focus on recording, rehearsing, doing shows. I don't want them spending forever working on social media campaigns and creating content. I know that's a part of it, and perhaps we'll talk a bit more about that later on. But the key thing I noticed was that they sometimes need a bit more of an incentive to get over the line, and a lot of stuff is kind of taken for granted, if that makes sense. I think really with your UK artists, they kind of understand they have to work a lot harder to get the rewards that they're after.
It's interesting because there you start getting into, I guess, a cultural difference in terms of what people expect and so forth. I guess, Thailand is a different kind of market, but it's a maturing market in the sense that it's coming up, like what you were talking about creatively. There's a lot more going on. I mean, from my perspective, I've been in the business for 47 years now, and if there's one trend that I would have to say is the most significant, and it's interesting listening to you because you're kind of confirming this, is that the world markets outside the United States, the world markets everywhere, South America, Southeast Asia, all of them, Africa, Eastern Europe, they are all developing enormously successful music markets. Very much so.
And also, if you look at I always use this example, look at the Latino market, particularly over the last 10 years or so, and then you think, surely we have a language barrier there. But, no. Spanish, it seems to travel pretty well as far as I can see.
Right.
In where I am in Southeast Asia, you've got maybe 5 or 6 different key languages, obviously in obviously you have Japan and Korea as well. But you don't tend to find, we could talk about BTS and Blackpink all day, but we haven't yet found a Thai artist who has managed to cross those borders, and partly, as you mentioned, culturally, but also from a language point of view. And someone did tell me that there is some studies that have been made that actually tonally Thai is quite hard for Western ears to listen to. I don't know if that's true or not, but I would imagine there's something in that. But it's kind of like, culturally, you'll find that they will take on board, somewhere from an influence point of view, Western hip-hop and R&B and pop and rock and so on. But it doesn't seem to go the other way. Do you know what I mean?
Well, here's the question then, based on what you're saying. I mean, we look at Southeast Asia today, which for those of our listeners who don't know, Southeast Asia it basically consists of 11 countries. Brunei, Myanmar, Cambodia, Timor, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, I think the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and I think the other one is Vietnam. And,
that makes sense.
If you look at the studies, it's expected to become one of the most significant music markets in the world over the next 5 to 10 years. I specifically want to ask you, Andy, since you've been on the front lines over there for the last 18, what do you think? What are the factors that you feel have contributed to this explosive growth in that particular market?
Well, digital really it's made it more of a level playing field. So like to go back to what we touched upon there, a kid in Singapore can listen to music from Korea, and he can also listen to stuff coming out of, Buenos Aires, for example. So definitely digital has leveled that playing field. So the advent of obviously YouTube and Spotify, and more recently, I'm working with some artists now who are, TikTokers, right? It's kind of new to me, but that's definitely made it a lot more accessible. So you'll see Thai artists when they post on YouTube, the comments are coming in from Indonesia, from Philippines, they're coming in from all around the world, because now, people can access that music. So it's made it definitely a lot more accessible. So that's the main change. You mentioned something before about piracy, when I first moved there, not just on the audio, but on the visual market as well, on the movies that are coming recently from the cinema at that time. That is now completely gone, because obviously you can get it, you can download it quite easily, illegally. But what's happened over the last, let's say, when does Spotify roll out in Thailand, when does Spotify roll out in Singapore? It's kind of, the YouTube, when I moved there in 2006, didn't have any footprints on the ground that you could access it. But over the last 10 years, they've opened offices in all of these territories, particularly out of Singapore, and you have regional offices out of Hong Kong also, let's not forget. Netflix, for example, also running out of Singapore, and they are legalizing and legitimizing these platforms where people can access this music. So it's definitely, in my opinion, the advent of, more reliable and quicker broadband, and also the devices that go with it. Let's not forget, the smartphones that have come in, the bigger, the more capability with them, the faster connections and so on. And, that's definitely a part of it for me. Well, 100% it is.
Andy, do you think we're in a healthy period in the music business today as a whole?
That's a brilliant question, actually. So I got recently let go by Warner Music Thailand, right? But I actually started working for a UK-based publisher management company called Stereo in Manchester, where I'm actually from. And then I have been recently reading about all these layoffs and these changes at Atlantic. And obviously it's, on paper, they've had a brilliant year. The figures are very healthy, and, everyone's kind of like, they're talking about streaming as plateauing, and it doesn't seem to happen that way. And there's still a lot of revenue coming in. But a lot of these companies, obviously, they have shareholders, and they want to get a good dividend or return on their investment. So the pressure there is always to deliver. So to answer your question, I don't particularly think at the moment it's massively healthy, but I do feel that some of these new platforms that are coming through and some of these new initiatives you keep reading about, they want to do like this thing with superfans. They want to do more in AI. They want to do more with licensing catalog to a lot more different aspects of revenue streams for creating content, for example. So I think if you think globally, I think we're probably in a bit of a state of flux. It's not going to be like the late 90s again. I don't think it's going to be quite as bad as that. But I do feel there's going to be a lot more shake-up and a lot more redundancies and a lot more people on the market looking at different roles and repivoting in the next few years. I think it's going to get even more streamlined. And, obviously artists can now record, distribute, market on their own platforms, or they can use people like TuneCore or Believe or CD Baby to get their content out there. So, we all know there's more content created now than there ever has been in the last 30, 50 years or whatever, since the phonogram was invented, whatever else. But it's getting your content above that noise. That's what's going to matter. And that's where we're going. So it's going to be basically the artists that can market themselves the best, I think, is how it's going to work. You're always going to have the majors that have that, the deep pockets, and also the know-how to get their particular artists front and center. But I'm not sure. I don't think we're in a particularly healthy time at the moment, though.
Yeah, what's interesting about listening to you, Andy, is that the other factor to that is that the major labels, all of them, not just one or two, but all of them have consistently on a worldwide basis lost market share over the last 5 years.
Yeah.
And I think that, to your point that you just made, I think that's going to continue to happen because of the reasons you've been talking about, because artists no longer need, 6 figures in money to make a record like they once did.
They could be more self-contained.
Much more self-contained. And the ability, most importantly, they have the ability now to reach an audience via technology. And, that is, the key point you made is one that is my mantra, which is that the most important commodity today in marketing music is not power or size of your market or PR or anything like that. It's the ability to get people's attention. And the reason that's the most important is because it's the one thing we cannot buy anymore. And the major labels are learning this, in the hard way. Yeah. I'm not a believer of this whole thing of, that the super fan and all of that is going to totally make up for the point that you're making, which is that, more and more artists can put music out. That world that they dominated, that world that you and I grew up in and started working in, that doesn't exist anymore. Where, an artist is signed simply because someone at a label deemed them important enough to be signed. We don't live in that world anymore.
Well, I was going to say, basically, we're of an era, obviously, and I sound like a couple of old dinosaurs, but, I remember, bands having 2 or 3 albums to progress their careers. You buy the first one, okay, yeah, this is pretty decent, and then to move on. There was always that thing about difficult second album, but it's a given fact. Bands were given longer and more resources to develop their sounds.
The artist development
20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, artist development.
Yeah, 100%.
Yep.
100%. And labels were willing to take bigger risks. And I think, going back to sort of this generation, I've got nieces and nephews of earlier 13, 14, 15 years old, and they all love like Chappell Rowan and Taylor Swift and Sabrina Carpenter. But, look at their attention spans. It's it's crazy. So I think, there's going to have to be a huge sea change, or it's just going to are things going to get shorter? I don't know. how can we go any shorter than like a couple of seconds? So it's going to be interesting. So yeah, I feel that that's definitely changed, and I think you're right about the labels and their market share. I think I don't know the figures exactly, but obviously if you look at something like the cumulative market share of all the independents, I would imagine they're probably at least maybe second or third in that actual global market share. It's so they've got a lot more say in it.
No, they absolutely do. Coming up, I remember a statistic once that I heard in the 90s, which is that on a worldwide basis, if you looked and took all of the money that was made in music on a worldwide basis, 65% of it at that time came from the United States. And 35% came from the rest of the world. Now, literally, that has been completely reversed. Now, on a worldwide basis, 65% of the income for music comes from outside the United States, and only 35 to 37% comes from within the United States. And, people always said the number one commodity that the United States was known for was, the export of its culture. Well, that's changing now, and and I always say it's not because America went down; it's because all of these other territories came up. All of the region you've been in, you were on the front lines of that in Southeast Asia. You literally saw it go from this tiny little market that was filled with piracy to a vibrant, healthy community that can, that all the major labels are supporting today.
Yeah, the sheer volume and numbers are not. I think it's something like there's 175 million people in the Philippines. It's like it's considerable. And then, as you say, if you look at the cumulative effect, and if you can look at kind of cross borders and that put aside language and cultural issues, then absolutely. And one thing I've definitely noticed since kind of we've got through the COVID period, that on my LinkedIn profile, for example, I get a lot more traffic because people are looking at it and going, Asia, that's, we up until recently, we weren't really focused. Oh, maybe Japan, that would be great if we could get there.
Right.
But like I said at the top of the call, it's more about people are realizing actually we could get a career over there. We can go and do shows there, and we can actually make some impact across there, because it's too big to be ignored. And I think it's fascinating what you're saying about the reversal there. I would imagine it's kind of then made up of like Germany and the UK and Japan and perhaps, France, I don't know, Spain, perhaps. It's certainly a lot more diverse than it was, yeah.
Yeah, very much so.
Andy, how has the rise of digital platforms and social media outlets in Asia impacted the music industry there? And how have you leveraged these developments in your work?
Well, it's made, like I alluded to before, it's made things obviously a lot easier to distribute and get the eyeballs and get in front of people. But it's also made it a lot more content heavy. And then it's how, as I said before, how do you get above that noise? How do you get their attention? How do you get them to focus on that? So it's made content a lot more throwaway. It's made the songs a lot shorter. They go straight into the choruses. I don't know about you, but if you get stuff sent on a SoundCloud now or YouTube, you look at it and go, oh, it's like 3 minutes long. That feels long.
2 minutes and 30 seconds. Yeah, I see now the average is like 2 minutes and 30 seconds on a song. Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah. So I feel that it's definitely made the bands more and the artists more aware of grabbing that attention, but also the technology that people have now to record. Also, it used to be that maybe you had something like a program on a PC or on a laptop, but now you can create all this stuff on your phone. It's also made collaboration a lot easier. Let's not be totally negative about all of this. You can get cross-border collaboration going a lot easier. People are sharing files and they're cutting vocals and they're cutting bits of beats and they're sharing through IG or to order. So it has made the collaborate, particularly in where I am, it's made those kind of cross-border collaborations a lot easier. And you'll find also, say, a Thai artist may have a verse in English, or they may have a hook in English, just kind of to sort of draw people in. And it's not necessarily the native language, but they've sourced that from somewhere. So it's made that a lot easier. But, I sound like a broken record, pardon the pun, but it does make it really difficult to kind of, okay, let's say with Warner's, we had, I'd be working on release. I'd have like 12 releases a week, just on Thai artists. And it's like, okay, you can't take all of those to Spotify. You can't get Spotify New Music Friday on every single track. YouTube aren't going to make that a priority track for every single week, because you're up against all the other majors and all the other independents that are also after that market share. So it just made it extremely difficult So you think, okay, maybe this band can come and do some shows here, which certainly helps. I do believe in like traditional media and print media and doing like the radio and all the kind of rounds that we used to do. I still think that's very valuable. I think it's more, you have to get the balance right. You know, no one's going to sit in a van and drive around the US and do how many states you've got over there, 52, is it? Something like that anymore. It's not like you could actually do that and break America. And in Asia, you would be better off focusing, okay, well, I want to go and do Singapore, and I want to play Hong Kong and Bangkok, and I want to do Taipei, for example, and you do 6 or 7 shows and all of that, and you do all the press that's offered to you, do all the promo that's offered to you, and you work it. You'd have to come back. You'd have to hopefully play the bigger markets when you come back. But the changes that I've seen is, the technology has made it a lot easier for these collaborations and obviously to get this content uploaded and in front of people.
In management and an A&R perspective, what are the qualities or what are the specifics that you're looking for? You've had an extensive background in A&R and in management, and I'm curious, number one, what are those? What is that criteria? And number two is, has that evolved over the last several years?
You know, the criteria for me is always the songs. I know it sounds, I have worked with artists and you get a little bit, I don't know about you, but you get caught up in the hyperbole, and it's like, okay, and you're looking at how they come across or how they look or how they dress, the image. Obviously, it's really important, right? And then you realize months later, but we haven't heard any songs. They haven't done any writing. They haven't been in the studio. We haven't even got any kind of like idea of demos or what we're going to put on a record, or are we going to do an album? Are we going to do an EP? So for me, it still has to be the songs, right? It still has to be the songs. And like I said before, so how hard are they prepared to work? Are they going to do interviews that with 12-hour time differences? Are they going to be able to cut that kind of the touring side of things? Are they going to be able to get up in the morning and also create, but also be wise to what's going on the social media side of things? You need their input on that as well. So yeah, the criteria for me is I want to learn from them. I want to be able to go, okay, well, you're a lot younger than me and you're a lot closer to what's actually going on. So the criteria there is, okay, what are you going to bring to the table? I can bring in the network and the experience and the know-how, but you need to really, really, like I say, work really hard. And that's what the most important thing is. And do it while you can, because as we all know, as we grow older, you do lose that spark and that energy and that enthusiasm. You can't keep doing it. And I feel that, particularly from a touring point of view, you have to kind of do it while you're younger.
It's funny, as you were speaking, I was thinking, and I was just having this discussion the other day in my class, that the Beatles put out 13 albums and 26 singles that weren't on the albums in a period of 8 years. Their entire recorded output came out between 1962 and 1970. That was it. I mean, it was a staggering amount of content. And there's not, you can't point to any of their albums and say, oh, that was garbage or that was, no good.
No.
And I mean, to your point about, work ethic and drive. And I mean, imagine the kind of schedule. Now, McCartney has addressed this. He said, everything was smaller then. He said, we didn't take 6-7 months to make an album. At least in the beginning we didn't. And he said, and we also didn't do, 6 or 7 month long tours. Our shows were like 35, 45 minutes and we would do 6 weeks. He said that was the difference. We did a lot of work and we consistently worked, but that's how they were able to get that staggering amount of content out in such a short period of time. And I began thinking of like big superstars today and what they have accomplished in 8 years. And it's like 2, maybe 3 albums in 8 years.
Well, we're in a different cycle.
We're in a different
back
cycle.
Then in the 60s and 70s,
you
were putting out albums every 6 months. I mean, that was the norm back then.
Exactly. So it is interesting to hear you speak about that. Also, I think when you're younger too, you have much more energy and much more, willingness to do the kind, have the kind, because you were speaking about the creative and you were speaking also about the non-creative, which is that drive and that commitment, which is so important today. And we constantly emphasize that on this show. Eric and I are always talking about that. If you don't have that, if you're really not committed to this as a way of life, then you should really be thinking about something else for your career.
Yeah, sorry. Well, I was going to say one thing I was going to say is that in fairness and mitigation, it seems to me from my side of the desk here that a lot of the hip hop and R&B guys, they do seem to put out a lot of content.
Yeah.
And is that because it's a lot more minimal? I mean, if you say, let's take Radiohead as a sort of not a great example, but it's a very layered recording process, right? And, they'll kind of agonize over like every single thing. Whereas, you've got these guys like Extension, I know people like that, they've got this archive going back, like drives and drives of tracks that they're still releasing posthumously. And it's like, is this because these guys can record on the back of the bus when they're touring? Or is it like they've got teams of them working on beats? And it does seem to be that some people do seem to actually be able to produce a lot of material. Whether it's good, bad, or indifferent is a different conversation. But it does seem that some people seem to still have that drive. And it looks to me it's more like the hip hop and R&B community where it's a little bit more minimalist. I don't know whether you guys kind of agree with that or it's kind of like a bit of a contention, but that's how I see it.
No, it's an interesting point. It's a valid point, but I think that today the point you're making I agree with, but I think there's a bigger overall issue from that creatively, which is that I think that artists today, that one of the more important elements to what you're saying is that the need to maintain a consistent relationship with your audience, regardless of genre, is there. Radiohead came from a different era. They came from the era when it was like, hey, Andy, here's our brand new album. We'll see you in 2 years. We don't live in that era anymore. We live in an era where it's like, if a single doesn't do well, you get the next one, or you get the next one, or you consistently maintain. And I think whether it's R&B or folk, or especially with a lot of independent artists, where that whole concept of an album, I don't even think new artists should do an album until there's an audience.
Right.
Because I don't think there's anyone there to appreciate an album. Nobody will listen to a body of work by an artist that they don't know.
I think there's still an added pressure too of even artists now that you're thinking about. You got to have 10 songs ready to go. So if the first one doesn't work, you got another single coming out in 3 months. That's another added pressure. We talked about the cycle of the Beatles working in that 6-month period where they were releasing stuff every 6 months or more. Now it's been reduced to now like every 3 months you're putting out stuff. So there's an added pressure there, which there's part of it I agree with, part of it that I don't, because to keep the level of putting out great songs, because I don't care who you are, you got to be putting out great songs. It's great that you've got a ton of ideas.
I agree.
But a lot of those ideas are not going to go over good. So I would rather take the time. I'm from that school of thought. I mean, I'm an artist myself too, of like taking your time and making sure you're putting out the best possible piece of content that you could put. I would rather wait much longer in between releases than putting out stuff that's just going to be shit, that people are going to go, like that.
Quality over quantity, we call it here. I mean, the other thing I'm kind of aware of is that people, from talking actually to my niece more than anything else, is that, her generation are more like, we're fans of songs. We're not necessarily fans of bands, and it's like, okay, we like that song by Chapel Roan. We love that song by Billie Eilish, but we don't actually like everything that Billie Eilish does. Do you know what I mean? It's
right.
I kind of do get, I get that. I mean, when I was a kid, my favorite band was Spandau Ballet, and it didn't matter if they put out a bad rap album because I would just love them because I loved Spandau Ballet.
Right. It's a different time then there.
Yeah,
you had
right.
you had the time to read the liner notes, knew who they were. You had MTV coming
Absolutely.
up. Yeah. So it was a much more bigger relationship, which, we talk about that too on the show about how to build that relationship. But I think you're right. A lot of the kids probably now, Generation Z, are not looking to artists more of the identity. They're more referring to their songs.
Absolutely. And I think, to your point, Andy, which is a great one, the values. The values among the audience that Eric's talking about are totally different. Like what your niece said is a perfect illustration of that. The values they have. And the way you distinguish that is by they like Billie Eilish's songs and they'll listen, but then, ask them who among their friends who loves Billie Eilish will spend the 40 or 50 pounds to go see her live.
Yeah.
That's the,
absolutely.
Or buy a piece of merch or join the fan club or whatever it is. And that's how, and what I see from an A&R perspective, which I find really interesting today, is how that process, what it is in a world where whether it's a brand new up and coming band from Manchester or Beyonce, it doesn't matter. The music is free. So what is going to make someone like your niece love an artist, not like their song, but love an artist, because that's where careers are built. And that's an interesting, thing to explore from an A&R standpoint, because it's not the same. Like the point you made about Spandau Ballet is brilliant, because that is a testament to what I think was about the values. You would get that album the day it came out. You would sit and listen to all of the songs. You would buy the singles and listen to the unreleased B-sides. All of that. I mean, that was a different relationship than I think kids have to artists today. So it's more interesting to me from an A&R standpoint what it is that people are willing to commit to from an artist, because the economic barrier to enjoying an artist's music has been removed.
This is why the major labels are going to that whole idea, what you were referring to, which I've been seeing the same trend too, where they want to focus on the super fans. They're trying to develop that audience more with the artist and the music fan. And that's why you're seeing that trend towards the super fan, because what you just illustrated, the Generation Z, they're not connecting the artist with the music. They're just connecting with the music. They love that song from that person, and they're moving on to the next one. There's no relationship. And I think that's why you're seeing the trend that the labels are moving toward, at least the majors are moving towards, creating more of that super fan relationship.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, and good luck with it. I hope it kind of works out, because we need to move forward. We need to get over this kind of bump, and we need to kind of see, okay, well, what's next? And yeah, I do agree. I think they do tend to kind of, there is an element of following the crowd there as well. Okay, if such a label is doing this, and but it's always been that way, hasn't it? Okay, well, this artist works really well, so we need to find our own versions of that. So yeah, it's an interesting time. It'll be interesting to see what happens over the next 5-6 years, because who knows where the technology is going to be as well. That's the other thing.
Yeah, precisely. And as you were speaking, Andy, I was realizing the other thing that's happened in a related industry that's parallel is the same thing has happened in the movie business, and it's more of a cultural element where I'm a huge film fan, and one of the things I've noticed since I'd say the last 5 years is that people don't, under any circumstances, with very, very rare exceptions, people don't go to movies anymore. And the reason they don't is because the elements of what takes its place, the streaming, the volume of stuff they can get, how a lot of these films that do come out theatrically will be on those platforms within 6 to 8 weeks, not 6 to 8 months.
Sometimes the same day.
Yeah, sometimes the same day or the same weekend, literally.
Before. Yeah, that's right.
And I think it has changed our relationship to it in the same way that the relationship, when we went from a copy model of vinyl or cassettes or CDs to an access model where we got whatever we wanted, wherever we wanted, however we wanted, on any number of devices, on any part of the planet, we got it for free, and that changed the whole relationship to it. So, we're facing the same kind of thing now with music, and I think, like you said, it's going to be a very interesting outcome over the next couple of years. I wanted to ask you, speaking of this, it just kind of reminded me of a thought, Andy. Throughout your life, have there been any films or books or documentaries that you've seen or read that you have found particularly inspiring, professionally speaking, that you could recommend to our audience?
Well, it's probably the wrong answer, but my favorite movie of all time is Spinal Tap.
Oh, okay.
Love that movie. Great fan
Yes.
of Spandau Ballet, by the way, too, just to throw that out there.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Of the same kind of, but yeah, I absolutely love that movie, and the fact that when I found out it wasn't a genuine band, and B, those guys are American, that kind of blew my mind. So I watch that like twice a year still, and I see new bits every time.
Oh, yeah.
So that's for me. I know it's probably not the answer that you were kind of expecting, looking for. I saw something more recently. There was a documentary about George Martin's studio that he built in I think it was in Montserrat.
Yes, it was called Under the Volcano. Okay. Brilliant documentary. Yeah. I saw that. Yeah, I saw that documentary. It's fantastic. Really, yes. Now that was an era where that documentary was made. That was an era when labels spent and artists were able to spend enormous sums of money to go to faraway places like Montserrat.
That's right.
To make records at George Martin's studio, and he would put them up. And, I mean, with Dire Straits and Sting and all of these wonderful people.
That's right.
Music. The Rolling Stones. Yeah, Stevie Wonder, Rolling Stones, McCartney. They all made music there, and now nobody goes to these destination recording studios anymore. Certainly not, the way that they did in that documentary.
I loved it. I can't remember him, the guy that produced the Brothers in Arms album, but there's an anecdote in the movie where he said, I looked at one time and everyone's in the live room and everyone's like in like towels and beachwear, and I'm like, actually maybe we're a bit too relaxed, and they kind of gone too far the other way, because like you say, where was the nearest label rep at New York? He's not going to be coming down to like knocking on the door making sure they were working hard. And then I think they made the record in like a third of the time that they were there. But look,
right.
We're still talking about it how many years later, like 30 plus years, 40 maybe years later. So yeah, you're right. I mean, the budgets aren't there. There's absolutely no way anyone is allowed to kind of do that anymore. I mean, the last record I can remember was probably something like Sowing the Seeds of Love, Tears of Fears, around 89, where it was like, how long did they take to make
4
that
years,
record,
David Bates tells the story about, it was a 4-year process, because what they got that they didn't like after a year and a half of working, and they redid it again. It's funny you bring that one up. That's one of my favorite albums of the 80s, that particular one. Yeah. And they just put out a 6 CD immersive box set on the making of that album. Wow. It's brilliant. I mean, if you like that album, you should listen to it, because it's all of the songwriting demos. It's all of the different mixes. It's all of the different approaches that because that is a very, very, very ornate album. I mean, there's a lot of time, effort, and energy that went into the making of that. Right. And when you listen to this album, if you give the time to listen to all the CDs in it, it goes through the whole process of how that record was done, and it's amazing. I mean, if you are interested in that process, which I know you are, your roots are in that world. Yeah, for sure. It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating, especially if you know the material.
Yeah, brilliant album. It's a masterpiece.
Yeah.
So they've done a deep dive on the archive there. So there must have been like literally hundreds of, maybe even thousands of DATs that they've just had running in the studio all the time. That's definitely something I want. There's something I really want to check that out. Yeah, that sounds great.
Oh, it is. And I just got another one from that same era, a few years earlier. It was the Waterboys' This Is the Sea, which is one of my all-time favorite. Yeah, that's a brilliant album. And he too did a 6 CD breakdown, and that's just fascinating when you see like the mixes, how he wrote the songs on piano, and how he would write the songs, but he wouldn't have the lyrics. When you get into that kind of immersive kind of thing, Pink Floyd did that with The Wall, and you got to hear all of the demos that they used on that. And to hear David Gilmour's demos of Comfortably Numb were just, I mean, it's astonishing. He didn't even have lyrics for the piece.
He's back on tour, like in the last couple of weeks. He had a #1 album in the UK last week.
Yes.
So there you go.
Yes, there you go. And he's still out on tour. Absolutely. Absolutely.
No, I was just going to confirm. Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to basically agree with what you're saying about, these are phenomenal records that they've obviously spent labors of love on, and they've probably lost band members, and people have left and come back, and people have died or whatever else. And it just seems to have gone on forever. But, the end result, and, here we are a few years later, still talking about them.
Yeah, they were classic albums. Do you know about the Classic Album Series, that series of DVDs called Classic Album Series?
There used to be a show when I was a kid. It was on BBC Two, which was like that, and they'd look at Appetite for Destruction and Regatta de Blanc and Hysteria. I'm a massive Def Leppard fan.
Yeah.
So the record, I don't know if it's the same show, but it was called it was basically classic albums.
Yeah, I think they did one on Def Leppard. They did AC/DC. I think they did one of the Def Leppard. They did Stevie Wonder.
Yeah, Stevie Wonder. They did Steely Dan's Asia, Elton John's Yellow Brick Road. But they're all classic albums. Like to your point, they're all like these albums that have are considered like masterpieces in musical folklore. And this is kind of how they were made. There's a fascinating one on Who's Next, because
my brother loved that.
Oh, it's a brilliant one, because you learn from the documentary that was never an album that was meant to be. It was never, ever meant to be Who's Next. It was meant to be the next project called Lighthouse, which was this massive project after Tommy, and it never, ever came to fruition. And so when the whole thing collapsed, they basically went to New York to record, the 7 songs, and that's what became Who's Next. But the intention was never to make an album. It was to do this whole show, and they go into that in the making of it. So it's
I never
very,
knew
very
that.
interesting. Yeah, I think you, of all people, would really appreciate that.
Well, my brother really got me into The Who when I was, he was like one of the influences, and he would be listening to The Who a lot in the car and Men at Work and The Police and people like that. So yeah, I'll definitely take a look at that. I'll go back and have a look at that.
Andy, what do you feel holds artists back from success in their careers?
Oh, luck is a major part of it, I think, and timing and awareness of what's happening, like not just globally, but locally in their markets. If you're talking about bands, quite often internal politics, arguments, the stresses and the strains of particularly of touring is unless you've done it, it's extremely hard to do, especially in the early days. So I think, you can have we all know, we just mentioned a few bands like War Boys, for example, they should have been much bigger than they ever were, but they didn't necessarily get those sort of breaks. They didn't get maybe that certain support slot, or they didn't get that particular movie or whatever else. So I think luck is a huge part of it. You can work like a dog, but if you don't get those breaks, but then again, people say you create your own luck. You have to put yourself in that position. So yeah, I think, running out of steam is another. It's just like they get disillusioned. They want to go and do something else. It's a really difficult question to answer because, we probably all know people that we think are great songwriters or great performers, and they should have gone on to be huge, but they're kind of still never actually made out of their hometown. But like I say, also just have that awareness of what's going on, being able to be flexible, to celebrate the small wins. I think that's really important too, because then you go, okay, well, we've established a little bit of a foothold here. Don't take those things for granted. Again, once you start doing that, you're going to find yourself slipping down that ladder quite quickly. So yeah, it can be a myriad of things that hold bands back, a myriad of things.
Andy, what advice would you give to Western music professionals that are looking to break artists in the Southeast Asian music market? What advice would you give them?
I would say initially just be very aware of the cultural differences. Okay, we've talked about language, but also the cultural differences. You have, particularly in Thailand, you have issues with religion, with monarchy, with economics. You see a lot of examples of people coming in kind of like using, say, the US model or the European model in kind of trying to break artists, and it's just not going to work in a million years. You have to be authentic. If you can collaborate with a local artist, or if you can work with someone with boots on the ground, that's really going to help you kind of get over those barriers. Learn a bit of the language. That also helps a lot because people will respect the fact that you've gone an extra mile to kind of learn a little bit, particularly with press and promo in life if you get over there to do some shows. But yeah, and also be patient. If you really want to make a go of it, you're going to have to come back quite a few times. You're going to have to really work hard at those markets because the distances are quite wide. It's not like just going to the US and playing a state after state after state. You're going from totally different countries and languages literally in the space of a day. And yeah, again, echoing what we said before, just be aware of what's happening locally. What can you adapt to? What can you hook onto? What's the trend at that time? Okay, so people are consuming a lot more content on TikTok, for example. Okay, are we going to go down that route? Do we have a TikTok account? Do we have a TikTok account that's in Bahasa or in Tagalog or in Thai? All of those things can really, really help you if you kind of adapt your content to local flavors. So I would say definitely be aware of what's happening, at a really grassroots level.
Andy, I want to ask sort of the same question, but I want to reverse the angle.
Yep.
What advice would you have to offer for serious artists who are committed to building a career in music today?
If it's a band or even not, if it's a solo artist, I'd say really focus on your writing, okay, and get tight and spend a lot of time in the rehearsal room. And perhaps just listen to the bass and the drums, or listen to the bass, drums, keyboards, or the guitars. Strip everything down and don't over rehearse, but certainly have a listen to actually what you're doing. That's the key thing. Also write, but don't be scared of throwing away stuff that you think everyone develops, right? We all develop over time in whatever field we're in. So the songs that you write, initially you're going to think of the bee's knees, but don't be scared to throw stuff away or to put stuff on the shelf and then use it later with maybe another piece of music and get something from that. Also, don't, get out there. I sound like a old school dinosaur, but play as many shows as you can. Play house parties, play coffee shops, have an acoustic set that you can bang out in case the guitarist is away for a weekend. If you get offered anything, initially, I say do it, right? I've had bands, particularly in Thailand, like, I'm not too sure about this opportunity. You're like, really? You know, honestly, you're at no level yet. At the point where you could start turning stuff down, then that's when we have another conversation, right? Initially, I would say play every single place that you can, because you never know. One person's going to bring their friend. They might add you. They might like you. They might stream your track. It's just, you just never know who's going to be at that show that particular night. So, yeah, I mean, I would say also don't spend your entire time focusing on your social media platforms, on your content. I know it's really important. I know we've touched upon it before, but particularly over the last 18 months, you see a lot of these major label artists coming out now saying we're just completely burnt out. We're just trying to keep on top of content and having to post every day and having to think of new ways to create TikTok content and whatever else. I've said to bands, particularly in Thailand, you're not digital marketeers. You're a band. What are you doing? You're spending way too much time thinking through how it's going to come across, when do we post, what should we post. It's important. Don't get me wrong, it's a real integral part, but it goes back to what we said you asked me about from the A&R process about the songs. If you haven't got songs, you've got nothing.
I agree, and I think it gets back to what you said earlier. It's about the quality over the quantity, and when we talked about releasing songs on a consistent basis, it's hard for anybody, very rare, with maybe the exception of like Prince is the only person I can know that can release that kind of content on a constant basis, because he was constantly writing. I think the same thing goes for social media. I couldn't agree with you more. I think if you have a great post that you can kind of post, and then whenever the time is right again, you post again, it makes more of an impact to me than being down everybody's throat every single day at every single moment. It's just too much. I think we're reaching the whole zenith of that era, and I think it's going to end up, there's going to be a crash, like everything, like a market crash in the stock market. I think there's going to be a social media crash where it's just how much can one human being consume in one day.
I hope you're right, actually, because it would be a great reset. I mean, I truly hope that that's what's going to happen, and maybe then we can look at it and going, all right, well, let's go back to, I mean, you mentioned films as well and whatever else in any form. It's not just talk about music. I hope you're right that actually we go back and go, okay, well, what's a bit more authentic and what's a bit more kind of, I've got this song, I want to get it out there, but I don't necessarily want to have to spend like 2 or 3 days working on, I don't know, a campaign around the release of that. It'd be great if they could go back to that focus, I think.
Andy, how do people best reach out to you and connect with you?
Oh, LinkedIn is great. So you can find me on there, no problem. And also I'm on Facebook and on Twitter. But you mean like email address as well?
If you're willing to, I mean, that's up to you. If you have an email contact that you'd like to share with the audience. Yeah,
you can get me at andy@karmasoundstudios.com, which is the studio that I used to work at. It's based over in Bangkok, actually just outside Bangkok. It's about 90 minutes outside the city. But yeah, you can find me on most socials. I don't do IG or Snapchat or TikTok. Without contradicting myself, I kind of find myself spending too much time on social media already from a work point of view. But yeah, I'm more than happy for people to contact me anytime.
Andy, we want to thank you so much for taking the time to do this. We really appreciate it. We're very, very grateful to you.
No problem.
This has been a really interesting conversation on so many levels. And I certainly hope that, I feel that our audience has gotten a lot out of it.
I've really, really enjoyed it, guys. Actually, I mean, the thing is here, it's actually pretty late, but I managed to get like a bit of a boost of energy. I had a cup of tea a little while ago, but no, I've really enjoyed it. It's kind of gone in a direction I never thought. It's been great talking about some of those great records, and I'm definitely going to go away and check out that Tears for Fears a box set that you were talking about. That sounds amazing.
Absolutely. You definitely will enjoy that. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Wow. I am so glad that we had Andy as a guest on the show. That was a really interesting conversation, and one that I've been wanting to have for our insiders for a long time, because this is a very, very important market. It's probably, it's one of the most...
I think it's our second guest. We had Carl Congham from Warner Music Thailand, so it's just very interesting.
Warner Music Thailand, yeah, exactly. And he talked about a lot of those same points. And, the thing that I thought was one of the most interesting points that Andy made was that the impact of piracy, which was plaguing the whole region, has greatly diminished with the rise of digital platforms. And, it was a significant issue when he first got there. If you remember, like when he spoke about that, and how now it's much more, and that's true, I think, in the United States as well. One of the things that, people often complain about streaming, or that it doesn't pay or whatever, it's which is a whole other conversation. The point being is that one of the things it did do is I won't say completely eradicated piracy, but it eliminated it in a tremendous way. And that I thought was a very interesting point that he made in terms of the growth of that particular market.
Yeah, and speaking of digital platforms, when he spoke about, digital platforms like YouTube, Spotify, and TikTok that have played a crucial role in increasing the accessibility of music, contributing to the growth of the Southeast Asian music market, I think it goes back to your point earlier, how it's, shrunk that whole thing down, where now the ability to be exposed on a worldwide level instantly is now accessible to anybody and any artist at any time.
Absolutely, Eric. And we see this with other genres. We see, Latin music is probably the greatest example of your point.
Right.
Where, people like Bad Bunny, people like Karol G, people like J Balvin, massive, massive superstars. Latin music was very much a 10% market for as long as I've been in the music business, up until like 2018.
Right.
And I believe a lot of the factors you're talking about with regards to Thailand, we're seeing that on a worldwide basis, which is really interesting.
Africa, another emerging market that's starting to really take hold in the global markets.
In the global music market,
right.
Absolutely. The other point that I thought was fascinating is how he talked about the cultural differences in Southeast Asia between the regions, and how that influences how music is produced and perceived. With Thailand, I guess, being perceived as a maturing market in the global industry, it perhaps has had more time and energy and artists. Carl also talked about that, being the president of Warner's for that region, but how you're going to see the other regions of Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, like the Philippines, starting to develop more of these aspects that you were speaking of with regards to a varied and wider musical styles.
Yeah, and I also thought one that was really interesting, that's really top of mind now currently with what's going on with the industry, is that, what he talked about with the music industry seeing shifts with companies like Warner Music Thailand undergoing layoffs despite the healthy financial figures on paper. And we're having that here in America with the current shakeup that's happened, like with Atlantic, and that whole current shakeup and whole hierarchical structure of how things are being run there at that label. And so I thought that was really interesting to see, because as the labels seem like they're constricting, they're still having major, successes, but you're still seeing this constricting down of what's going on the major label level.
And I'm glad you said major label, because it is on the major label front.
Right.
The major labels have the biggest challenge on a worldwide level, musically speaking, because their challenge, because of their size, is how do they become relevant for a world that no longer exists for when they were invented. That's the key thing. And when you look at regions like Southeast Asia, and mark my words, insiders, I believe that the Southeast Asian market will become one of the top 3 music markets over the next 5 to 7 years. But to your point, I believe that success will be achieved by a greater and greater diversity of record labels, rather than just the major companies.
Hey, insiders, thanks so much for tuning into this episode. We really appreciate it. To get show notes, links, and everything that was mentioned during this interview, head on over to our official website at MUBUTV.com/podcast/show notes. If you're enjoying the content and what we're doing here on the show, please subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts from. And don't forget to rate and review our show at iTunes. 5-star reviews are always welcome and help to ensure that our podcast stands out on the top-rated and new and noteworthy charts on iTunes and our space. You can also find us at social media at Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter X, all ending with the handle MUBUTV, which is spelled MUBUTV. Don't forget to catch our flagship show, the MUBUTV Music Business Insider video series, airing every week on YouTube at youtube.com/MUBUTV. This show was produced and created by Ritch, Esra, and Eric Knight. Theme music by Disciples of Babylon, and be sure to tune in next week for another episode of the MUBUTV Music Business Insider Podcast.